Camera one's moving again.
It is?
Yeah, it's focused back on the rabbi.
But it's got, the red light's on it.
Well, it's on, it's video.
It was showing up.
It's
Well,
showing up.
all we need is one camera that's
Yeah,
on the sensor to be.
that's what we got.
Camera Tuesday.
Yeah. By the way, I saw,
Yes.
I got a background in social hall, so I don't know that kind of thing with the two now, because I got
the relays.
That's not shut, I'm not shut those doors here. Shut the social hall.
One of the runners was.
It'll be all right. And when they get rid out of there, it'll be back. It'll be fine.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I got.
I mean, if it's not, like, I'll come out all that.
Right, and I just stopped back and Lawrence will take care of my business.
Rush up people.
Ruin, you know.
Ruin. They should did the right thing with Rush. You know, they let him get his time. Same thing with Henderson. We don't need them that bad. Let them get there, let them. I want these guys to last, don't bring them up and ruin them because they're young and inexperienced and it gets to their heads.
All right, well, have a good afternoon.
Thanks, you too. Take care.
How are you?
Right, how are you, Russ?
Good.
What you looking for?
Nothing, I'm behind the scenes, I'm waiting for everybody to come in. I'm back there.
Don't hold your breath.
Why, waiting for everybody to come back here?
Don't get up when I put these back. Okay. Good. And my wife cleaned them, and then she left them back there. She cleaned them, and she back in for the holidays. She wanted to clean them up, so she cleaned them, but she only did half a job. She left them back there in the kitchen. Yeah, it's supposed to be, but it must be it's on Jewish time. Yeah.
Doing it in here instead of the chapel.
Because it's on Zoom. And in the chapel, we'd have to use the iPad.
Right.
They're not on. I'm like, well, that one I think
They're
is
on.
on. That one is?
They're,
Okay,
well,
maybe it's going through.
well, it's picking up from back there, because I could hear it.
Okay.
Back.
I didn't hear anything just now.
I know, I'm blowing shofar this year. Here.
We lost some
I'm
people.
one of the 3 shofar players that are taking lessons with the cantor.
Rick Frankel left. Yeah, and so did, they all went to Custer.
Yep. So we have 3 new shofar players. And the cantor calls my shofar a piccolo shofar because it's a little tiny ram's horn. It's like this long, and it has a really high pitch. And the other 2 have this long spiral shofar oak. I guess they come from ibex or something. But those have a bigger, bolder sound. Straight ibex. Yeah, they're straight spiral. Spiral. Probably not that.
Well, I'm prepared to teach. I'm just waiting for this rabbi.
Waiting for the rest of the congregation.
I think they went home already. We started too late.
Oh, we got about a half dozen on Zoom.
Practicing, I'm loosening my lip.
Ah!
For shofar playing.
Hello and welcome to Beth Israel. Come on down to Delaware today on this week's Kiddush Conversation.
And you're on Zoom right now.
Hey now!
I don't know if that one's turned on yet.
Yes, you. Uh-oh. That's not good.
Well, back to work.
Yeah.
Welcome to back where.
All right, boys. Keep it clean. you get the rabbi, please? Can we get the rabbi so we can start? I would like to go home and take a nap. Shabbos, I have one Shabbos. I'll sleep till half past. Trust me, I can take a long nap. Thank you. It's really good to see you guys. And if I get rid of the sinus nonsense and be fully back, I'll be very happy.
What was your favorite meal in Italy?
Oh my God, there was this pistachio pesto you could get on pasta that was like fabulous. That and fresh fish. In Catania, you could get more fish than where we were. When I was in Catania for a couple of days, I had fresh fish every night. Like bronzino, like the most unbelievably fresh stuff every night, which was wonderful. But this pistachio pesto stuff was like, because I love pistachio nuts. And now in Sicily, they have a lot of pistachio nuts are a Sicilian thing. So they think it's a Sicilian thing, and there's pistachio everything. There's pistachio ice cream, pistachio this, pistachio that. So we had tons of pistachio. It was all really good too.
Where was your favorite wine? Was that in Sicily?
What wine?
I would suggest, can we get a few copies of this bill circulated because it's not
Sure. There was some really Sicilian. Yeah, it was really nice, like good white, very straightforward. Oh, white, green, but it actually really tasty. I had a lot. But I had very good. And they actually real full body reds. Yeah. Sicily is known for those, but I only had that one. Because I didn't have any meat, so I didn't have any reds. I enjoyed that. Thank you. Go for it. Hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and children of all ages. Welcome to Beth Israel Kiddush Conversation. Thank you.
Well, I mean, actually, it is a problem, but I'll do it.
It's the lesser of two evils,
Yes,
because we'll just see that.
So are you speaking from up there or from over here?
No, I'm coming to join you.
Ah.
I'm gonna do it with this device with which I'm at work, but that's okay. We will make our peace.
Debbie. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to this Kiddush Conversation. Today we'll be discussing Aleinu.
Yeah, so let me just set the stage very briefly. I thought slight variation on what was advertised in advance, but the high holidays is a time of year in which our communal proceedings are characterized by a distinctive liturgy that really reflects a lot of the insights that we are going to. I've got some wires loose here too, but they can't be jiggled into place.
Why don't you just use this one? Hello? Try that.
There we go. This will keep us with arguing with one another because only one of us is audible at a time. So the high holidays is a time of year in which our tradition, our sages, have kind of helped to point our thinking and shape our emotional trajectory, in part through the liturgy that they've gifted us.
we have certain prayers that are either unique to or unique in the way in which they get deployed in the High Holiday Liturgy. And this is, I mean, the Chazan can tell you, for people who train in the cantorate, the High Holiday Liturgy is, a semester is a year?
A year.
Is a year. I thought it was a year, but I didn't want to overstate things. Is a whole year's study. So we could go on about this ad nauseum, but we have 3 weeks until the high holidays are upon us, 3.5 weeks. So we just wanted to focus on 3 distinct elements of the High Holiday Liturgy to talk a bit about the prayers themselves, about their history, about their content, particularly from the standpoint of the theology they represent, some of the insights they give us into the way that Jewish people historically and contemporarily think about God and some of the questions they raise. And in the case of each of the 3 prayers that we've selected, there are also aspects of the musical setting, of the choreography, of other aspects of the prayer that are interesting. And our hope in doing this is to give you a little more texture, a little more richness to your high holiday experience, to do the work of Elul in preparing for the high holidays. So with no further ado, I was not joking when I said that the real experts in the Jewish tradition on Jewish liturgy sit in the cantorate and not in the rabbinate. It's actually somewhat, no, it's really the case. Every individual ordained as a cantor has gone through a really deep, immersive education in our liturgy. And there are select rabbis such as myself who take an interest in liturgy and try to play a bit of catch up, according to our own tool set. But I'm going to allow Cantor Matus to open our discussion today.
Okay, so we have a weird overlap issue, Rabbi and I, with theology and history kind of cross over each other over what this means, and what it meant in different times in history, because that will affect, I'm going to talk about basically the history of this prayer. And the problem with the history of this prayer is how it gets looked at different periods in history will determine what happened to it, what they did with it, and that all depends on theology. So we wind up crossing each other over a lot of times. So if you suddenly see us passing this mic back and forth quickly, you know why. All right, so Aleinu is a polemic against idolatry. And until the Middle Ages, there was an additional phrase that we don't usually recite anymore that goes, "For they bow down low to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God that cannot save." Medieval Christians had a field day with this one, to say the least, and there were some serious problems with it, including in the 1530s, there was a Jewish apostate who first converted to Catholicism. His name was Anton Margarita, of all things. And Anton converted then, and then converted a second time to Protestantism. And his book, where he discussed the fact that this was a curse against Christianity, wound up being repeated by none other than Martin Luther in his book On the Jews and Their Lies. Charming book title, I must say. And eventually communities self-censored the offending passage because it was causing so many problems. But by the 18th century in Prussia, for example, which is part of Germany, was the most powerful German state actually. In Prussia, it was actually banned by the government not once, but 3 times from 1703 to the 1750s. By that point, nobody was even reciting it anymore, but the government made such a stink that they even went as far as to ban it outright. So how far back does Aleinu go? Well, that's a very good question. The answer is, like most Jewish things, nobody really knows. All right, it's old. The Rokeach, if you know the soap, the Rokeach was a rabbinical authority in medieval Germany, and he believed it dated all the way back to Joshua. That is incredibly unlikely in my opinion, but it definitely goes back, way back, pre-Christian, and some believe as early as the Persian period, and they believe the proof for this is in the phrase Melech HaMelchei HaMelachim, the King of Kings. It's a very interesting phrase. King of Kings. I mean, it's not just King of Kings, which we all may know from the Hallelujah chorus. The King of Kings was the title the Persian kings called themselves. Persian emperors, the kings of this Persian Empire referred to themselves as King of Kings. They were not just kings, they were the king over kings. So they went double down even more, and king of kings. So this was supposedly a reference to the Persian Empire. But that's true only of the first paragraph, because the first paragraph and the second paragraph were actually composed at two separate periods, it's thought, correct? Yeah, it was thought to be performed at two separate times. And the second paragraph is likely to have been composed later, possibly even after the destruction of the Second Temple. So its first appearance in manuscript form, now remember, manuscript form for prayer books does not come until quite late. And they're handwritten, and we have very few of them, all right? So one of the first ones we have is from the 3rd century CE. It's a Rosh Hashanah liturgy by the Babylonian sage Abba Aricha, and it is credited, as is all of Malchiot, to the fellow Babylonian sage Rav, who was, I believe, earlier. Was he earlier than Aricha? Do we know? I don't know. I don't know all my Babylonian sages in order, so forgive me. I'm not a Babylonian sage expert. But it existed certainly in Machzor Vitri and in Ram Gaon, Amram rather, contains by the 12th century, it's in its complete form as we know it now, more or less, with the exception of the offending phrase was still back in. And Machzor Vitri, which dates to about 1000 something, was written by a guy named Simcha Bar Shmuel of Vitri, and he died in 1105, and he had been a student of Rashi. So his Machzor, his famous Machzor Vitri, very famous, and one of the earliest prayer books extant, has a lot of stuff in it, and including our first extant example, complete, of Aleinu. Now, this great Aleinu was only meant for Malchiot, the kingship section for Rosh Hashanah. And of course, as you may know from a traditional synagogue perspective, it has its own specific tune. Aleinu, na 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 na. Very wonderful melody. Now, there's a great story about this melody that dates back to 1171, when the Jews of Blois, France, or spelled Blois for those of us who are not great French people, Blois were burned to death in an auto da fe by the local French. And the Jews of Blois apparently sang this melody and sang Aleinu as they were being burned to death, which apparently astounded the local Christians. And you can actually find this melody in parts in other Christian liturgy. So they heard it and apparently ran with it. Whether or not that's true, I have no idea. It does make, however, for a very interesting vignette. Now, interestingly enough for that phrase, the offending phrase, the Hebrew word for emptiness is varik. Yeah. Varik also sounds like the verb to spit or spittle. And so it was not uncommon in the Ashkenazi world for people to, how shall I put this politely, spit on the floor. When they got to this word, varik, ptui, and they would spit on the floor, which was a particularly revolting habit. And when they first developed synagogue rules about etiquette in the 19th century, one of the first rules they came up with is, don't spit. And that's why they had the spitting rule, because people would spit there. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yes, they did. The comment was that in certain synagogues in Europe, if you look, you can find a spittoon. Possibly for this, and possibly because chomping on cigars became very popular in the 19th century and causes a significant amount of saliva, rather disgustingly. Anyway, so this was a thing, and this is mentioned as early as the 15th century. In critical sources, people referring to the spitting as being disgusting goes back to the 1400s. So that's how long that habit stuck around. So, you know, it's one thing with Judaism, you know, we have a wonderful way of picking up things, and we have a real bad way of getting rid of them. We're not good at that, you know? So it's a very interesting text, and there's a lot more to talk about when we get to the modern period. But first, we have to discuss some basic theological stuff, none of which is basic, with the rabbi.
Thank you so much.
You got it or no? Okay.
I think at the moment that I'm okay. If I drop out, you'll fill in. So with all due respect to the Chazan and to the ideology that he has provided for this phrase, Melech Malchei Hamlachim, it nevertheless provides us with a theological quandary, right? Because we are, as we all learned early in Hebrew school, as the Rambam asserts as kind of the singular, incontrovertible premise of Jewish thought and Jewish belief, monotheists, right? Judaism is all developed around the idea that there is one God whose providence is all aspects of existence as we know or could conceive of it. But this Melech Malchei Hamlachim, taken at face value, whether the phrase was lifted from the Persians or not, connotes that God's role is what? The king amongst a community of kings, right? That there are other kings out there, there are other entities of more or less comparable status, and that God is the head honcho amongst them, which points to a polytheistic cosmology, to a polytheistic understanding of the way that the cosmos are created or exist in their current form, and that we just happen to be the nation that is fortunate enough to be in relationship with the God who is the most powerful of these many supernatural entities. And there are, in fact, multiple places in our scriptural texts, in our liturgy, and in other writings that support the idea that Judaism did, in fact, begin as a tradition that accepted the existence of other gods. I mean, think of the narrative of Eliyahu and the Baalites, right? So Eliyahu has been cast into exile because he is a persona non grata with Ahab and Jezreel, who are sitting on the throne. He takes flight. He makes his way back into town. Now, Jezreel is a follower of Baal, and so he comes back into civilization because he's going to set things straight amongst the Jews of the northern kingdom, the Israelites of the northern kingdom. And he says, tell you what, I'm going to prove that my God is the more powerful of the entities, the supernatural powers who are being worshipped here, because my God is going to provide fire for my offering, whereas their God is going to be unable to provide fire to accept their sacrificial offering. And they have a showdown, and sure enough, Adonai shows up and, zaps the offering, it catches fire and is immolated. And that's how we know that we are in the right to be worshiping Yud-He Vav-He, and they were wrong to be worshiping Baal. But if you read the text, it never says that Baal doesn't exist, or that Baal, was an imaginary creation, or not in fact a supernatural being. It just says our God what? We had an arm wrestling encounter between the deities, and our God came out on top. That mindset, or rather, should I say, that wrestling match, is embodied in this first section of the Aleinu. It goes back and forth, right? It refers to God as Adon HaKol, as the singular master of all that is, asserting this monotheistic outlook, but then it also refers to that God as being Melech Malchei Hamlachim, reflecting this obviously prevalent idea. And if there were other gods out there, they wouldn't really matter anyway, because they're subservient to our God. So, major question, major point of contestation that's obviously going on in our tradition amongst the intellectuals of our people in the period in which this text is coming into being. One that I would say is largely resolved in our own time, right? I don't think there are members of the Jewish community today who seriously believe that there might be, some mini gods out there who are performing in supporting capacities. Even those who are more involved in angelology, or whatever it's called, don't understand them to be sub-gods in a sense. But there's also a question that that is paralleled in the theology of Aleinu, which falls under the broad rubric of theology as well. We know what we know or think we know about God. So what? So what does that mean in terms of God's relationship to us? And that's where some of this this further contestation surrounding the Aleinu liturgy becomes interesting, because it actually engages in the discussion of where our belief system and we as a people stand vis-a-vis other peoples. And as the cantor just shared with us, there was at one point historically an explicit statement, and now is still an implicit statement, that we are the people whom God has selected, who God has embraced. And these other nations, while they may be created by God, are not embraced by God to the same degree, that they are somehow afforded a secondary status in not the pantheon of gods, but in the hierarchy of nations, which again makes Aleinu a very contested text contemporarily amongst members of the Jewish community who are unapologetically Jewish, but feel awkward at the least about making a statement that is so openly an acclamation of Jewish supremacy, of placing ourselves at a different tier, not just in a contest amongst nations, but in the eyes of our Creator than our fellow human beings.
That's why Reconstruction changed the wording.
Well, I'm getting
Correct.
there.
What's that?
Wait, I'm getting there, wait.
Yes, and the Reform tradition even more so if you look now at their
Don't
latest.
steal my thunder,
Yeah,
lady.
so I was going to say, and with that, I want to pass the baton back to the Chazan so he can talk about something.
Thank you. So this break between particularism and universalism in the text is a big deal. So it appeals to the universal in the sense of everyone shall acknowledge that God is God, and that as our religion certainly considers idolatry to be beneath contempt, that idolatry will be wiped off from the earth, and everyone will acknowledge the true God, and of course that God is our God. So there is that particular thing, but it's also universal desire for the best of people to be the best of people. And reformers in the 19th century, when they came upon this text, didn't quite know what to do with it yet, because the universal aspect of that everyone will acknowledge God and will lead to a better time for everyone on earth, this messianic age, this what they preferred as a view of the messianic age, I guess, this version of that all will seek God, all will come to God, and will realize that we are all better together with God. There's a universalist aspect, as opposed to this very much specific Israel chosenness aspect, this very particularistic aspect. And the reformers had a great deal of trouble with this, so the early reformers just scratched it. Now, why did they have a problem with it? Remember, they're coming out of an era where they had not had emancipation. They were not citizens, they were subjects. Everyone was a subject, not a citizen. That's the first thing, except in France and the United States of America, okay? So we're talking about 1815, 1820. So Napoleon had been defeated, and briefly, just briefly in the German-speaking lands, Jews had equality, like for 3 years. And they liked it, shockingly enough. And they did not like this idea of the lid being put back on the box, of the genie being put back in the bottle, that they suddenly didn't have rights anymore. They didn't like that. And so they wanted to create a new synagogue service to show themselves, quote, worthy of being emancipated, close quote. The idea was that if we can show them that our worship service is beautiful, that our worship service is modern, that we embrace modernity, and we no longer embrace what they probably see as, and probably did see as, anti-Christian elements. If we get rid of those, emancipation will be easier for us. This is one perspective on the change. And the other, I believe, was real true belief that this was no longer a way of thinking that was going to, that had theological weight anymore with some of these people. I believe that they genuinely believe that also. But the time period leans more heavily on the first than the second. I think they were looking more towards the importance of emancipation and ergo changed theology accordingly. But I could be wrong about that, but that's what historians love to do, and they love to argue just like rabbis. So there you go. And disagree, which is why there's so many books. Now, so each synagogue in each community that had a basic reform or small r reform. We're not talking like Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, the movement. We're talking about like the local rabbi decided in conjunction with some of his friends, maybe in a different community, that he wanted to change things, and the community said, yeah, sure, and they published their own prayer book. They didn't get a prayer book from the movement because there were no movements yet. You just printed your local prayer book with your local tradition. And so you had some very prominent prayer books made, several made by one guy named Abraham Geiger, who is the father of the Reform movement, the real Reform movement as a movement in Germany. He became the head of that. He was raised as an Orthodox Jew, by the way, and his brother was an Orthodox rabbi. It's interesting, but very big machloket. Their seders must have been fascinating, is all I can say. Dinner must have been real interesting at their house on Shabbos. That's all I can say. But he was not a radical reformer, but he was a reformer. So what he did was he just changed the text. He removed something, he rewrote parts. His Hebrew was very good. He simply changed it. And he changed the translation in German to reflect those changes he made in Hebrew that reflected his theological differences. His was probably the least crazy of the changes. The Hamburg community in 1815, which threw out all Hebrew and all Jewish melodies all together and went for a completely German service that was something like out of a Protestant church, they got rid of the text altogether. There was no such text like this anymore for them. And in the American Reform community, beginning in the 1850s, you had two different rabbis in the United States who represented major things. And one was Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the father of the Reform movement in America, who wrote a book called Minhag America. That was his first prayer book. And he also kept the text to Aleinu, but with changes. And then you had someone else who I believe was here in Baltimore, whose name was David Einhorn. And he was a radical reformer. He was much more of the, let's cut it, why not? Because I don't like it, so we'll just cut it. Not, let's come up with some adaptation of it because no, cut it. So he got rid of it altogether because he had issues with it. So this goes on like to the 20th century. This goes on to like last Tuesday, because I'm sure there's a new prayer book printed last Tuesday that will have some discussion about whether or not to use Aleinu or other texts. So that continues for quite a while. And yes, right into the Reconstructionist movement and all things which are 20th century movement, basically comes out of this. What are we going to do with this particularistic element? And can we embrace ourselves as having this special relationship with God without being seemingly superior? I think this became a real issue and remains, as Rabbi puts it, an issue for many modern Jews.
So I'm going to jump in at this point and talk just a little bit, then we want to open the floor so that it's a discussion and not just a frontal presentation, to one specific phrase in the Aleinu that has garnered more attention in recent years, in part because of the struggle that's gone on internal to the Reform movement about this text. And it occurs in the second paragraph of the Aleinu, at the fifth line, according to the pagination in our Siddur. So it's page 57, 5 lines from the top. And for a lot of individuals who recite the second paragraph quietly, and there is actually a fun setting to do it out loud, that feels a little bit like a horse race, but in any case, it says, "L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai." So many of you will be familiar, you look at the first two words, "L'taken olam," with the phrase that gets batted around a lot in Jewish circles today, especially in liberal Jewish circles, by which I mean conservative, reform, reconstructionist, renewal, and their derivative movements. Tikkun olam, the notion as it's commonly employed of improving the world as God's partners, as individuals entrusted as a species, in a sense, or as a people at least, entrusted with partnering with God and taking an imperfect creation and making it something that more closely resembles what God had intended at the outset. The thing is that the actual root from which this phrase originates is from the form takana, which is a formal halachic term, it's a formal rabbinic term that occurs in the Gemara, particularly in Masechet Gittin. And what a takana refers to is an attempt to fix something, but what is being fixed is a place where the law, as promulgated in its Peshat form and its most straightforward reading in the Torah, is unmanageable when lived out in human society. So the most obvious example, one of the examples used to illustrate, to teach the concept of a takana, is the prosbul, is the decree by Hillel the elder that said, well, in the Torah, we're taught that we're going to forgive debts every 50 years, but what happens is when you say that if you lend money, and it's coordinated across the whole society, so as you get closer and closer to the 50th year, moneylenders who know that whatever portion of their loan has not been paid back prior to the 50th year are like, well, why should I advance you a loan? I'm not going to get it back. And so the prosbul said, wait, there has to be a mechanism by which lenders are able to recoup the money that they still have outstanding beyond the 50th year, because in the absence of borrowing, all but the most affluent individuals in a society are not going to be able to engage in commercial affairs. And so that's one of the most famous of the rabbinic takanot. But there are a whole sequence in, Gittin is the Masechet that has to do with divorce. One of the most famous takanot in that scope of rabbinic affairs, of human affairs, has to do with the fact that it was once permissible, according to the Mishnah and to the earlier rulings of the Amoraim, it was permissible for a man to issue a get to his wife who lived at some distance, a divorce document, and to send it by messenger to her, but then, before she had received the document, to pronounce the document null and void. So the document would arrive at some distant location, the woman would receive this get that allowed her now to go on with her life, to be out of this relationship, this failed relationship to her former spouse, and she would proceed with arranging wedding to a subsequent spouse, only to find some matter of days or weeks or years later, as she's living as the married spouse of the second individual, that the document that released her had been negated, was no longer a valid document. Now, once that was a possibility, of course, what it does is you dial back, and it means that in any instance in which a woman received a get that was not right there in the presence of her husband, that she had no effective basis to remarry, because she could never know if the document that she had in her hand was valid or not. So this is not a livable situation. And what the rabbis did was to issue a takana that said, it's called takana hasofel, that says, no, you can't do that. If you are going to challenge the validity of a get that has not yet been delivered, if it's been delivered, that's it, the divorce is taking place. And if you're going to challenge it, before it's delivered, you have to do it in the locale where the woman is located, that she would be aware of that challenge and would be apprised of the status of the document. Not a small thing if we think of the whole phenomenon of agunot in our own day, where divorce remains such a thorny and contested matter for the Orthodox. The point, though, is a takana is not, in the sense of tikkun olam, us following a mandate from God and carrying it forth in the world as ordained by our source. It's a case of human beings contesting the text. So where? Imagine I have it's Chaim, here we go. What? This can stay here.
Contesting this text, right? It's saying what's in here doesn't work for human beings.
It's saying this, God, you had your idea of how human beings were meant to live in the world, and when you try being human and living that way, it doesn't work. Which is a really different conceptualization of what humans' role is in taking Torah and embodying it in the world. It stops being this extremely hierarchical relationship. And it says we're sitting at a table together and we're having a discussion, and you bring your divine intuitions on things, but we bring our lived experience, and they somehow sit in parallel to one another. That's a pretty chutzpahdik claim for humans to be making, but that is the original understanding of takana, of this idea of what it means, the takein olam. It means going right back to the original source text and critically evaluating its contents. To which the obvious question is ad kan, right? What are the boundaries? Once you say that this is not inviolable, that every word in here does not just exist as a force forever in the world, are there any innate boundaries to that exercise?
I'm a little puzzled by how you changed from the tikkun olam, which means to repair the world, meaning to set it right, and you went on to talk about what you're talking about.
So the historical sequence is reversed. The takana, in the sense of challenging the divine's notion of how human beings, how in particular the Jewish people could live within God's law, that goes back to the Amoraim. That goes back to Babylonia.
You mean that preceded the tikkun olam?
Yes. So we tend to think, we who see ourselves as halachic movement, who see ourselves as conservators of the Jewish tradition, think of ourselves as living in far more staid and narrow bounds, and the Reformim, the Reform Jews, as being the ones who, when things get inconvenient, toss them to the wind and head out in their own direction. In point of fact, the way that the Reform movement reconceptualized and domesticated Tikkun Olam makes it a far more constrained role for humanity to play vis-a-vis our Creator. So you're absolutely right. If we had started at, so whatever God said, we abide by it, we just go out there as good soldiers and manifest it in the world, and then some modern authority had said, but sometimes it doesn't work, throw it out.
Rabbi Landis actually puts it quite nicely here if you want to read what he said first.
Go ahead. I'll put it in Rabbi Landis's words. He's an outstanding teacher.
Okay, the perfect world under improving the world is nowadays a popular slogan. Since it is employed imprecisely, it is important to understand its halakhic origin. Tikkun olam originally applied to a takana, which Rabbi was discussing, which is a legislative order by the rabbis for the public good. More precisely, a takana is a rabbinic enactment imposed when the practical application of a biblical or rabbinic law is perceived as unjust or no longer effective. A takana would override, restrict, or change existing practice. The power to impose this may seem heretical, as Rabbi was just talking about, but as evidence of the rabbi's faith in the efficacy of Jewish law, etc. So, the most tikkun olam is a takana intended to prevent social or political injustice. That's
So
one point
they
of
took
view.
this broad category of takana and they said, oh, specifically, we do this when it would result in an unjust society. Which then, if you think about the circumstances in which it gets applied, are far more circumscribed. And typically not actually at odds with established halakha, right? When you're going out and collecting trash by the roadside or providing meals or social connection to people living in institutional situations or putting solar panels on your roof to save, the burning of fossil fuels, you're not doing anything that's at odds with established halakha. You're improving the world in a way that feels good, but it actually is reinforcing the established biblical precedent and values. A takana is saying I'm true to the values, but I'm actually not true to the pshat, the straightforward, obvious reading of the letter of the law. So are we good to throw out some...
I'd even expand that on that, which is
sorry.
something that Maimonides said, according to Rabbi Landis. By virtue of wisdom, the Torah is positive personal behavior. Hold on a second. We achieve tikkun olam and the continued existence of society in the best way possible. For Maimonides, tikkun olam is no longer just a takana for the sake of Jewish society in a difficult social situation, but a tikkun, or betterment of the world. Tikkun olam becomes the pronounced goal of mitzvot in general. So that concept that we know it now as sort of to improve the world really begins kind of with Maimonides. At least according to Rabbi Landis.
Yeah, although I'd say it was not in common parlance in the way that we deploy it today
Exactly.
until actually early 20th century.
It's very interesting that the first rabbi that you quoted, that was when you talked about
Remember this?
yeah, he said social and political injustice.
Right.
And I think most of us probably associate it along with social injustice, but feel uncomfortable with political injustice.
Can you repeat that?
I hope I'm getting this right. We seem to be more.
Can I give a second?
Yeah, please do.
So what Mark had said was that in Rabbi Landis's synopsis of the concept of tikkun olam as contemporarily deployed, he holds in parallel the desire for social justice and for a political system that is just. And yet, in most of our sensibilities, or perhaps as Jewish communities, we tend to gravitate around the first part of that, the idea of social justice, and feel less comfortable with the notion of saying that tikkun olam moves into the realm of political life and is a correction of something that's gone awry in our political affairs. Is that a fair synopsis?
That's because the social, because the political, repair of political is more partisan or polarized than social. Most people agree somewhat with what social justice is. It also depends nowadays on the political situation, but political is more polarized. That's why we feel less comfortable with that.
So just for the benefit of those who are following from home and may not be able to hear comments coming from the participants on site, what was offered in response very thoughtfully is the idea that perhaps our heavy tilting towards social justice over this more political interpretation of the phrase tikkun olam is because there's more of a consensus around what constitutes a social good or social justice, whereas when we move into the realm of the political, it becomes divisive, and that is something that certainly synagogues and Jewish communities, maybe more broadly, have tended to steer away from.
I think that the political is not as obvious you don't see it in the community as easily. It can be done behind your back, can be something that's just quietly left out. But you can see the tent cities, you can see people that are losing their homes. This would be a social thing, and you would understand and want to help. But you often don't see the politics that made that happen.
So I'm going to abbreviate this just because it's a restatement for those who are on site. I hope everybody who's on site was able to hear very thoughtful rejoinder, rebuttal to what was offered, which is that perhaps the reason the political stays out of our frame of discussion, frame of action in a synagogue or Jewish community context is because the end product, or the more proximate product of social injustice, is something that is in front of us and flagrant, whereas the decision-making, the political activity or inactivity that brought it about is hidden from viewers, something that is further removed in time, and so we are less likely to be incited to respond to it. I want to, if I may, turn the discussion slightly just so that we stay in keeping with the portion of the Aleinu that is, I think, central to its deployment at the high holidays, and think about the theme of particularism and universalism, which are both present. You know, you can cite a number of examples of each of these interpretive strains in the Jewish tradition. But to throw out as a question for you, does a discussion, does an awareness of the, in particular, particularistic dimensions of Aleinu as the text was originally framed, change the way that you relate to this liturgy as a liturgy that is now part of our daily prayer service in Shabbat and every holiday, and of course the high holidays as well?
Yeah, you're saying, yeah.
That was my starting point.
Oh, sorry, never mind.
No problem. Any thoughts?
What was the question exactly?
Does the particularistic strain of Aleinu, I think a lot of us, one of the things the Chazan didn't say, but when you participate in a prayer service with somebody with a magnificent voice standing in front of you and singing the liturgy, you know, in glorious strains, he could be saying, you know, we're all lemmings marching out to, you know, the edge of the cliff. And you would be singing along full-throatedly because it's so magnificent to participate in that act of communal singing.
Well.
But when we put the brakes on here and we say, let's dig into the text a bit, do we stand behind this text? Does your relationship to the Aleinu become more difficult or problematic?
So this is not exactly addressing the question that you're asking, but it's kind of related. Because when I work through the liturgy during the high holidays, I hear a lot of sort of anthropomorphic images of God. And I struggle with it. It's like in the Aleinu, we have King of Kings. So I feel like it's just not right to put God in human terms. To me, that is a conflict internally. And I understand why it's done, but I have a problem with it when I reach it in the.
I think you point out the difficult issue of putting God in human terms.
That's what he said for the
Right, I'm anthropomorphical terms. The problem of putting God, describing God with human terminology or putting God in a human-like form. This is the problem with human language. You know, and for example, many languages have to choose genders. English is lucky in that we kind of can do neutral, sort of. But other languages can't because they just have masculine, feminine, neuter. They have what they have, and that's how they work. But human language is very limited. And you'll notice also in liturgy, frequently, when in doubt, add adjectives. right? So, it's not enough to say we praise God. We have to praise and loud and exalt. I mean, there's literally like 6, 8 verbs there to describe, how you're going to praise. And, I mean, the number of like adjectives used to describe just in Kaddish alone is like 6 before you get to like the verb, right? God is this, very typical. So this is a problem of human language, really. And all I know is that personally, like as someone who is involved in the liturgy business, is the only way I could think of to say it so intimately as I am, I try to remember this is just poetry. It's just the limits of language. And while I don't think of God as a king, certainly not in masculine or feminine terms, because God doesn't have a gender, because God is not human, God is not this universe, but I have to be able to talk about it somehow, right? And I'm using old poetry. So, okay. So I'm gonna use this old poetry, even though I know I don't believe what it's saying exactly the way it's worded, but I get the notion. All right, I'm gonna go with that notion, and that's how I'm gonna say it, because I'm stuck reciting stuff whether I like it or not, right? I have to repeat the liturgy because that's what I do. So I get to something like Ritzay, where I'm talking about the restoration of the temple service. Like, how do I handle that, right? So for me, I realized for my ancestors that was important. For me, it's not important. So I have to remember, like, for them, it was important. So when I say it, I think of how important it was to them. That's all. I mean, that's how I deal with it anyway.
Oh, yeah, that would be.
Even better.
Not my comments are all that.
Oh,
No,
yes,
no, no,
they
it just
are.
prevents us from having to, you're absolutely right, it allows people at home to hear it all the time.
So a couple of thoughts that I had with this. And I have to say, since I've been a minion leader for the past couple of years, I actually am paying much more attention to the words of the prayer. So apropos of what Mark was saying about the anthropomorphization in our prayers, I view that as we have to conceive of God somehow. And with what the cantor was saying, it's like we're limited by language. Okay, this is not working. But
if you come up, actually,
okay,
because you'll be away from the speaker.
oh, okay. And I think it helps it helps with the conception of God, because it's God is God. It's how do we know how to describe God? And we know that God has many attributes, and that's why there's different names of God. But I think putting it in human terms helps us with seeing the majesty of God. So I think that's a piece of it. I guess I sort of buy into our chosenness. So the ideas in Aleinu are not offensive to me, because we've all chosen to be Jewish. We could choose not, even if we were born Jewish, we could choose not to be Jewish. So this is sort of what I've bought into. And I actually like the language. What I have a little bit of a problem with sometimes, and not just in Aleinu, is when we turn serious prayers with serious concepts into singable ditties. And without,
Don't get me started on those.
well, no. I understand it. It's like, we right, yeah, it's like, no, let's all sing about resurrection, right?
Exactly. That's why I think that's the worst offender. Yeah.
So on the one hand, it helps with everybody, the power of communal voice, which I think is really, really important. But I think sometimes we mismatch melodies to our prayers. But you have to start somewhere. The one other thing, and this is a little digression that I had a question about, is, it was interesting when you were talking Melech Malchei HaMelachim, because I actually had looked at it more from the perspective of all these societies viewed their mortal kings as having some level of godliness to them. And this is really an affirmation that the mortal kings are mortal kings, and God is the real king.
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt that that's in there. The idea that in the societies going back deeply historically, but even, you know, through the European monarchies and similarly in East Asian societies, there was an idea, divine right as king wasn't just that a certain line was vested in the right to be the monarch, but that they actually embodied divinity to some degree. And I think that's inseparable from the conceptualization of who their divinity then was and what the relationship, because it wasn't this sense, again, of the single universal creator. It was a creator who somehow, or an authority, supernatural authority, who somehow had a particular link to your civilization, to your nation. Yes, please.
I'm gonna be the only one who stood up there.
I have a question, not just about Aleinu, but about all these prayers. If they had so few books to read from,
One giant step.
This is as far as I'm going. So, so if there were so few prayer books, and I imagine a lot of the people were illiterate, and the prayers are in Hebrew, how many people actually understood what they were saying? And how did they sing along? Did they do it by rote, like we do Aleinu or Adon Olam? Did they know what they were saying?
The average person?
Yeah.
You mean the average person, or the person who was the professional who recited them?
Both.
The professional who recited them hopefully knew. Did they always? No. This is a whole thing. The early era, when the title Chazan actually meant something different, the Chazan was also a paitan. In other words, he was also a poet who wrote liturgical poetry ostensibly on the spot, not usually, composed poetry that got added into the liturgy, right? So the fixed liturgy became longer and longer and longer and longer. That we all know, because we've experienced that on the high holidays. Even I have experienced that on the high holidays, that seems long and longer and longer. However, there were criticisms constantly from the Middle Ages on that Chazanim did not know what they were doing. And that Chazan, the letters themselves actually stood for, in Yiddish, Chazanim, Zainin, Naranim. Cantors are fools. Right, this the constant Chazanim, Zainin, Naranim. Cantors are fools. That's what they said the letters of Chazan stood for, because cantors were notoriously vain songbirds who didn't really know Hebrew very well, who weren't very knowledgeable, but boy, could they go on singing. To which I say, sour grapes, rabbis, on you. It's not my fault we're more popular. No, okay. This is an old, we were just talking about this. Historically, it's a long rivalry between rabbis and cantors. But no, cantors were notorious for being ignoramuses. Not here, no, and certainly not between us at all. But I mean, but a notorious rivalry, and a notorious, cantors were notorious for being ignoramuses, yeah.
Well,
At least by reputation.
Another kind of take on this that I'd like to throw out there is that if you look at the halakha of prayer, if you look at the debates and the resolution of the debates as to what should be said, when and how, it's a common refrain in the debates. Don't change this or don't make this different under different circumstances, because your Jew in the pews observing this is not going to get the nuances of the difference and is going to get confused between what's meant to be done on this occasion versus that occasion. So just keep it the same, even if like this bit of the liturgy doesn't fit so well for this occasion, because you change it and all is lost. You know, they'll end up adopting the wrong version at the wrong time and so forth. So clearly there was a concern going quite a ways back that you're dealing with a population who had a limited set of resources to invest in the education of the rank and file of the population. The education that Jews were receiving for most of Jewish history was overwhelmingly a religious education. In terms of their more formal education, they'd be schooled in religious texts in Hebrew and sometimes Aramaic and stuff, but for a limited period of time, and then they would go out and learn a trade. And so, you know, they were not learning world history and geography and mathematics and so forth. And so they had, I would dare say, more knowledge than we oftentimes find amongst our non-formally educated members of the Jewish community in a contemporary American context. This congregation being exceptional in the ability that it mustered to provide a really high level of supplementary education to students who were schooled in the supplementary religious school here, and the high rate of attendance in Jewish day schools in the larger Baltimore area. However, historically, people may have had a little more immersion in formal Jewish education in their early years, going back in time. But there's a limit to what you can teach somebody before they reach, say, 4th grade and leave formal school entirely. And as we all know, there are the students who absorb what they're taught and the students who absorb less of it, or for whom it's just not that important. So it's not like, despite the mythos that back in the shtetls and the Maburim of North Africa and stuff, everybody was religiously super knowledgeable and really knew all the nuances of texts and traditions, and now sadly that's all lost. It's been a struggle in Jewish communities for a very, very long time.
You're up. Yeah. Come on down.
We can repeat it if you prefer, or we can. I think it might provide feedback in that location.
Thank you. This young man is helping me.
He's a lovely young man.
I find the concept of chosenness very offensive, perhaps because I lived as a Reconstruction person for several years. And I also... All right. We can just leave it at that. Mark, you want to take this?
So I think so Shoshana voiced her own disquietude with the inclusion of a extremely particularistic element in the liturgy, this stream that is so prominent in the Aleinu, particularly in the original codification of the liturgy. And I think the fact that we have to put that condition on it, that we have to say the original form of Aleinu and then it changed, points to the fact, yes, there were political factors, yes, there were contextual, historical factors that made it very much in the interest of the Jewish community in certain circumstances at certain points in time to do away with some of the more triumphalist dimensions of the liturgy as initially composed. But I think there is more than that. I think we do ourselves a disservice to say that nobody also had a discomfort that wasn't just rooted in practical concerns with this particular stream. For one thing, we have this debate going on about particularism and universalism going very far back in the rabbinic writings and in philosophical and other treatises amongst Jewish writers. So there's a place to be uncomfortable and a place to celebrate. And I think one of the ways that Elisa framed this in terms of embracing that strand is to say, hey, we think we got it right here. Not we as individuals, not we do our genetic makeup, but we in what we represent and are reproducing as a Jewish community got some things right at a very essential human level. And if you, coming from a different religious tradition, buy into that sensibility or learn from what the Jewish people represent and are promulgating in our teachings and in our lifestyle and so forth, come on board. Like, it's not something that's the unique property of the Jewish people, but this is our heritage. This is our request to celebrate these values, to celebrate this tradition that elevates human beings and that has teachings that have now become commonplace throughout Western democracies and much of the world.
As to the chosenness thing, I also view chosenness as more responsibility,
Yeah.
not
Mhm.
specialness
Yeah.
at the exclusion of others, but we have more responsibility.
Well, can I have the mic?
Yeah, I was going to make a point on that too,
Yeah.
because in the text of the Aleinu, that paragraph that you were just going over, that soon we may behold your strength revealed in full glory, sweeping away the abominations of the earth, obliterating idols, establishing in the world the sovereignty of the Almighty. So, I mean, it's obvious why that text was written in that time period.
Yep.
But when we look at that text in our current society, it seems not universal. It seems anti-universal.
No, it's definitely particularistic.
No, it's ultimately particularistic. I agree with Lisa. Absolutely, it's about responsibility to carry forth something as opposed to chosenness. I mean, I had to struggle with this concept. I think all of us do it if we really think about this chosenness thing. But I'd like to remind you that every other religion talks about itself in a chosen fashion. You cannot avoid it in Christianity. You cannot avoid it in Christianity. That they adopt the idea of chosenness and chosen people of Israel being them. You cannot miss that in Christian theology. It is very loud, very clear, even in very liberal churches. So, yeah, we have our chosenness. Everyone else has got their chosenness too. This is not new. This is not just us. So I don't know what we have to be apologetic about. Huh? It is exactly, it's human nature. It's definitely a groupism thing. And human beings love groupism. We love our group versus that group kind of mentality is really a big thing.
Except for the fact that being chosen
Yes.
is the fact that other people, other nations, other religions choose to see it as something against them. So they've always, people usually didn't look at Christianity as being, just because they see themselves as being chosen, being against them. Other people didn't see them. And yet.
Are you sure about that?
What about the Crusades?
Sure. What about the Muslims?
No,
They didn't have a problem with this?
No, what I'm saying, the Crusades were against the Jews.
They were against the Muslims first, primarily, and the Jews. Right.
I always like the quip that says, how odd of God to choose the Jews. It's not so odd. The Jews chose God. I like that.
That's a nice witticism. I like that too. All right then.
Yeah. Yeah.
When the church came into the shul to find out what the heck was going on here, what did they do? And they saw the one person who seemed to be knowing who's going to go forward with that. And the other people really not doing anything except sitting there like fun and not being involved. And so those of us who are musicians and we think about the magnificence of music and coming together as perfection of harmony, that is what the greatest gift God ever gave anybody, no matter what the language or no matter what kind of oratory it is, so that we get them in between. But they said, you don't have to worry about that. Listen to what they sound like in there. They'll never attract anybody.
Interesting that you mention this. Okay, so Samuel Pepys, the English writer in the Restoration period in England in the 1600s, wrote, actually attended a synagogue service, and he said it was like a folderol. It was completely nuts. Of course, he probably attended on Simchat Torah. Because he said they're running around and they're all singing like different things at the same time, and it's a complete mess, and they're some of them are drunk, and it's noisy, and this is crazy, and a lot, it's very, so it's a given. Synagogues were really only open a couple of times a year to the to outside people. I mean, unless you was a spy from the church, right? Because they definitely had spies from the church who came. But in terms of musical refinement, that happens in the 19th century as Jews become emancipated or yearn for emancipation and become secular. They go to the opera, they go to the symphony, they actually hear other stuff. They hear, what when derisively one might call real music, and they liked what they heard, and there was also, and you're gonna laugh, but what about the young people? Was a real thing in the 1820s, because our young people don't like synagogue music. They want to go hear that new stuff, that newfangled, what was it, Beethoven, I think? But that's how literally but what are we gonna do to bring in the young people? Was valid in 1823, the same as it is in 2023, because they talked about the same thing. Oh, God help us. So yes, but that's gone on for a while. So issues of aesthetics became a real thing probably before then, among people who actually had been exposed to outside musical stuff other than street song or bar song. Jews just didn't have an opportunity to mix in the art music crowd until that became like a commercial enterprise. In most of Europe, that didn't happen until the 19th century, and then the public would go to the opera or symphony or whatever. And then people heard music and went, why don't we have something like what they did? And there came an idea of sort of how to graft the two of those together, which is a whole lecture in and of itself. An interesting one, but a one in and of itself, of how that worked musically.
So before we bring this to a close, there's one thing that we had agreed we'd introduce, or that we'd introduce into the discussion, at least before closing, which is to draw your attention to the fact that the cantor opened by talking about this very special setting to Aleinu that is used specifically when it is recited as part of the Malchuyot section of the Musaf Amidah on Rosh Hashanah. And if you will notice during the Rosh Hashanah services, it's not the entirety of the text that we now put under the umbrella of Aleinu that gets treated in that fashion, that gets elevated, and during which the Chazan and I will do full prostrations. It's specifically the introductory verses of the Aleinu that get treated in that fashion. And as such, it's a real conscious orientation of the verses to this idea of elevating this one God who is clearly sovereign over all. The opening refrain of Aleinu. And that is, of course, the theme of that whole section of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, the idea of God as king, the idea of God as sovereign over all that is. And in that sense, in the crafting of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, in the setting of this text, apart from all accompanying text, the liturgists of old clearly thought that of the various motifs running through this text, and of the various readings and contestations that might go on around its context, the thing that brings us together in the season, the thing that is meant to be the focal point of our thoughts and our relationship to it, is this idea of uplifting both this being that is at the center point of all of creation, whose birth is being celebrated on the occasion of Yom HaAdalah, of the birthday of the world, and also celebrating our privilege in having this unique connection to God. Thank you so much for staying and for having this conversation with us. As soon as I move this, we're in trouble. We look forward to joining you next week, joining some of you at least next week for a discussion of Avinu Malkeinu.
Avinu Malkeinu, yeah.
So I still want to know
Yeah.
Were they literate back, the people who went to shul? Did they have shul?
When? How far back?
Like 1,000.
Yeah.